Hey, this is Derek Murphy with creativity.com. Today I'm working on a personal biography travel memoir book cover, and I haven't done this in quite a while. And part of the reason I think is that even though a huge part of the self-publishing industry is probably people publishing their personal stories or their biographies or their travel journal, um, most of them can't afford real book design or professional book design. So there's probably a large percentage of self-published biography type memoir books that just don't have great design. And even with traditionally published books, because of the genre, you can usually get away with something a little more simple, even something like collage. So I want to talk a little bit about this project, some of the choices that I've made, some of the mistakes that I've made, and you'll probably get a pretty good introduction to book cover design in general, what it's for, what it needs to do, some of the big mistakes that first-time authors make. So even if you don't write this kind of genre, then this video will probably help. So the first challenge is just getting the genre right. So usually when I start designing a cover, I'll just search for a bunch of images and kind of collect not a swipe file, because a swipe file means things that you can use. This is just for inspiration. I'm not going to actually copy anything, although some of these are actual stock photography. However, when I first started designing this cover, I just had a kind of a quick glimpse of the genre. The author said that it was basically a thriller set in Mexico. So I was thinking it's a fiction book, like a novel, which is a thriller. That's the kind of cover I was going for. So some of my favorite covers for thrillers look kind of like this. Thrillers sometimes have a landscape in the background. Usually they have really nice typography done for a lot of things, or like a really close-up text with something coming over the fonts. This is common for thrillers. However, actually, when I read some of this book in the chapters, it's actually mostly personal biography or travel memoir. So you have to kind of know exactly who you're trying to please. You may think you've written a thriller, but if it's an account of stories, if it's a bunch of anecdotes about your life, then it probably isn't. There's a big difference between nonfiction, personal biography, travel memoir, and actual novels that follow a hero's journey, and they have certain plot events that have to happen to hold readers' expectations. So even though this is a much bigger market, even though the thriller market is a much bigger market, and I was going to do something kind of with the van, if we just made this a thriller cover, it would attract the wrong audience and they would be disappointed that it's not what they expected. So we really need something that's a little more obviously a travel memoir. And with memoir or personal biography or historical fiction to some extent, you probably want something like this. I picked a couple. I don't usually use this kind of montage cover. I don't think it's great design, but it kind of has its place, and especially if you have that type of book that has a lot of travel stories and a lot of photos, it makes sense to try to do something like this. Possibly. At least it's obvious what it is. It's obvious it's kind of a, it says Adventures in Travel, True Love, and Petty Theft, which is kind of a cool tagline. Some nice pictures. So this is definitely like a personal, a series of personal accounts, probably not a fiction novel. So this is a pretty good design. I mean, it works okay. It's not like I don't love it, but it's clear about what it's trying to communicate, and that's actually a big win, because if you try to communicate something else, this is the other one that I had marked. That's just a really nice. This is more of like an investigative historical one, but the color, the faded photographs, the combination of the map and the ruins is pretty nice. So, and even though it's this true story of two men, their extraordinary journey. So this is biography. It's the story of their journey, but then also the subtitle is the value, the discovery of the lost civilization of the Maya, which is pretty interesting, because if it's just a biography, like nobody's interested in somebody's biography. Nobody's interested in the life story itself unless it has another piece that provides value. So people who would read this book, they may not be interested in these two men, but they are interested in the discovery of the lost civilization of the Maya. So this is really the selling feature. The story is just the delivery mechanism to give you this value, to give you this content, which is the discovery. So if you're writing personal biography, I've gone through this with a few clients recently, actually, and they have a good story. They're writing, good stories, something they went through that's very profound. But other people won't be interested in reading those stories, even if they're really well written, unless there's also something else they're getting out of it. So it could just be like life affirmations. It could be like something you learned or lessons, but you have to think about what value are you imparting to the readers. Even if you keep them entertained to read through it and finish the book, what are they getting back? What are they getting for the time that they spent? What do they have, or what have they learned, or what have they experienced that is more than they had when they started reading the book? So I was looking for more kind of samples like that, and actually the author of this particular book, inside the book there's a bunch of photographs from the journal and the story. And you actually need to be careful with photographs because you may have a lot of historical photographs that can aid the story, but especially for the ebook version of your book, the more pictures you have in, the more it's going to eat up the delivery cost on Amazon. If it's a larger file, you'll earn less per sale than you would if it was a smaller file. So you may want to think about, instead of that, removing all the photographs and putting them up as like a series of blog posts. So like in the book, you could say, click here to see the photograph of this. You could also use like small thumbnails and then link to a high res version, or just at the end of the book, you can be like, click here and see all the pictures of this journey. Something you might want to consider. It doesn't really matter for the paperback. You wouldn't really have color pictures in the paperback anyway, because it would be too cost prohibitive, but you could have, you can put the pictures in there and they'll print fine for black and white, which might be nice. It may as well be nice, especially if you're mostly making it just for friends and family or historical records, just so that like someone keeps track of what happened. It's nice to just put the pictures in the book. That way people don't have to keep track of, something else outside the book. But anyway, I'm going to talk a little bit about what I've done with the cover. These are two versions. This was the first attempt I had made. It's just a really simple background, palm trees on a beach, and the VW van, which is a big part of the book. And at this point, I was still going for something like a thriller cover. So this actually it could have looked pretty good. I didn't finish it. You'll see the pictures are still watermarked. I could have kept cleaning this up and done a decent job on it. But since I don't want to give the wrong impression and actually have it look like a thriller cover, I want it to look like a personal biography so that people know what they're getting into. So this was the second version, and I'll tell you some of the things that I did that I like, and a few things that I did that is probably not a good idea. I actually make a lot of mistakes when I design covers. I'm using Photoshop, so you can't do all of these things if you don't have Photoshop, but you should still be able to learn a little bit about, what I've done with this cover. I'm also going to show you my layers panel over here so you can kind of see what I'm doing. If you're using Photoshop, if you're using layers, it's a really good idea to label each layer. Like in here, it's just a random string of text, which means every time I'm trying to find a layer, I'll have to click the eye to make it visible or invisible so that I can select the right layer. I really should just say like ferns left and label all of them. I don't usually do that, but that's a mistake on my part. It leads to a lot of wasted time. The other thing that I have is some color layers. So this is just a fill color, solid black that I've set to overlay. And all that does is bring out the saturation and vibrance a little bit. Down here I have one that's yellow. It's also overlay. Overlay will just have kind of a sharpening effect. This was what it had looked like originally, but I think the yellow gives it more of a vintage tone. The picture I just took from, it was one of the original pictures in the book. This isn't actually the main character in the story or the protagonist of the story. I think this is one of the other characters, but that doesn't really matter on the cover. It's an interesting picture. It really gets the feeling and the timeline. This is obviously like a 1970s travel memoir. I'm pretty sure I got the date right. So it's, probably a travel memoir about a VW bus going to Mexico, which is what it actually is. And I'll show you the earlier version. So if you look at kind of the basic blend, and I didn't even blend these very well. I also have this gradient layer down here. So all this is doing is a gradient from one color that goes to transparent. And then I've set it to the bottom. That just darkens the bottom a little bit so the text stands out. I think I'd probably have that on multiply. Multiply is better for darkening and making it darker, whereas overlay will just kind of sharpen everything. And so this is basically like just 3 combined photographs. This one is just a picture of a bunch of ferns that I grabbed and put in there. And then all I did was, with my eraser tool, which is here, I just very roughly deleted the top half of that photograph. Then underneath that one is this main photograph with the van, which is there. You can see there's some other stuff behind it. I'm just kind of putting over layers. I also had to make this extra little layer. There's a little bit of extra space between this photograph and how I wanted to lay out the ferns down here. So all I did was, with a rectangle tool, I copied the bottom of this photograph and I just pasted it again, which is this new layer. And then I just increased the size and I probably rotated a little bit just so it doesn't look like, I mean, you can't even tell behind here what's going on, but you don't want to just have like a repetition of the same plants and the same plants. So I moved it around a little bit and made it bigger so that at least you don't notice. And then on top, I think is just sky, basically. This was another one that I was playing with before, but I like the blue. It stands out a little bit better. And you can see, like, if I really zoom in, I didn't even, like, some of this is transparent because I didn't really blend it very well together, but nobody really is going to look that carefully at the details, especially once I put some new layers on top of it. So something that's kind of fun with cover design is that you can add more layers on top. So this karma down here looks fine, but I want to put some ferns on top of the letters, which is what I've done. I searched for basically PNG ferns, which just means that it's a fern without a background. So I could just drag them and drop them in here. If you wanted to remove the background of the elements, that's a little bit harder work. You can just pay someone on Fiverr.com to do it for you. Or there's some tools in Photoshop that let you do a good job. But if you really want to like cut something out really carefully, it's time intensive and you have to be really careful. So it just takes work, but it can be done in Photoshop. If you don't use Photoshop, if you're using another online design tool or something, you may want to think about just sending it to someone on Fiverr.com to remove the background, and they'll send it back to you in a PNG file. These colors are a little like, this is, the green doesn't match the bottom green, so it stands out more than it should, but that's basically will be fixed once I add some more colors. But it kind of gives it this nice 3D effect where, you know, some of the ferns are in front of the text and some are behind. This darkening effect that I have in here, see, it's not that bad when it's all like this, but because the darkening effect is behind these ferns, that's why it makes these ferns stand out so much. But if I also hit this color layer and I go up here and also hit this layer, doesn't look that bad. You just get some kind of lighting on the top of the ferns. So this already looks, I mean, it would be fine. It's an okay cover, but I wanted to do a little bit more. And so the interesting thing with book covers is you have to try to communicate as much as possible. You only have, like, this cover has to say all the important stuff about your book. I actually had a really long conversation today with another cover designer, and what we were talking about is how authors always want the cover to communicate their story, the story they have told, and that's not what a cover is for. They want to put all the right details in it, and sometimes authors want to say, they say stuff like, I want to stand out. I hate that all the book covers look exactly the same on Amazon. I want my cover to stand out. That's not how book cover design works. Your cover needs to fit in with all the other bestsellers in the genre. It has to look like it belongs in that category with those other bestsellers, and it has to be really obvious what kind of book it is, because nobody's going to read your description of your book and find out what your book is about if the cover doesn't already communicate that it's the kind of book that they like to read. So your cover really has to do its job. And also you don't want to repeat elements. So I'm tempted in here, and I should have a subtitle that says something like a travel log or a personal memoir, which I actually did. I have this little tagline that says travel adventures in Mexico and back. And I'll zoom in. And that's fine. Now we know it's Mexico. Now we know travel adventure. The font could be a little bit better on this little tagline, but I basically got the description right and the keywords right. It doesn't have personal memoir in there, so that's something else that you might want to fix. But one of the things that you can do is, rather than explicitly communicate the details in the text, you can add them with design. So what I had done was I took this map of Mexico, which looks like this, and then I just made a copy and I blended it a little bit. Oops, that's not the right one. Okay, so here's this other map that I had. And I blended it, I think, as darker color. Sometimes what you do is you add a new layer and you just play in Photoshop with the different blending modes until you find one that looks good. So I don't always use the same one. It depends what I'm using it for, and they have different, options, but you can kind of play around and see which one works the best. So it's a little bit too busy, but I kind of like it because it makes it more obvious that it's about Mexico. And even in the map, I have the word Mexico coming across in the letter B. So I think that looks pretty cool. You got to be careful about putting in too many details and trying to make it too cool with too many different little things, because readers aren't going to notice anyway. And the immediate impact from a thumbnail version, so when it's really tiny, is more important than the details. So the details don't really matter, because from a thumbnail, which means like the little tiny picture that readers are going to see on Amazon, they're going to have to decide whether this book seems like something they would want to read, whether it looks interesting. And they can't actually see anything besides the basic colors and the fonts, which is why fonts are so important. The fonts dictate what kind of book it is. So I was also talking today about how there's a lot of really good illustrators coming out now, so you can get a much cheaper art or illustration or Photoshop for your book cover. But a lot of the new designers who don't charge very much, they're not actually that great at font. And if they screw the font up, they've kind of ruined the art. Even if the art is really good, it can still do okay, but the job of the font is to communicate the genre. So if they use the wrong font, or the font isn't legible, if they can't read the text very well, then the book's not going to perform very well. So it's worth getting good typography. And this is one of the things that most new authors will screw up, even if they're doing their own cover, and even if they do an okay job of the background, they might screw up the typography. So there's a lot of choices that you could make, and this is actually a little risky because it does look a little bit more like, well, it looks exciting, travel adventure. It's a handwritten font. But for most, like if you want to do a more boring but very stable, simple memoir, you might want to do something like a simple serif font with really clean text, because that's more common for that genre. So the balance is like, this isn't quite a thriller cover that will attract people who are reading thrillers, but it might attract people who are interested in travel literature to Mexico, or they're thinking about going to Mexico or something. But it still has to look cool and interesting enough for them to take a chance on the story and start reading. Anyway, so I made these changes. The nice thing about, if you now that I have the map of Mexico, even though it's kind of too busy, but now that I have it, I don't really have to say Mexico here, because then I would be repeating myself, and you only need to say something once. And I talked earlier about the value you're providing. So you have to figure out what readers are going to get out of your book, what they're looking for, and make sure you have that in the cover. So I added something here that's probably too much. It's a personal travel memoir and Mexican adventure. That's probably too much text, but it has a lot of nice keywords, and it tells readers exactly what to expect, exactly what they're going to get. So it's kind of nice to have. I might make it really small and then try to fit it in the cover somewhere. I kind of like having it just on this half of the van anyway. So I made something like this, a personal travel memoir, Mexican adventure. It's not amazing, and I'd probably want to fix the font a little bit. One of the things that bothers me is that this white text really stands out for the cover, and it competes with attention for this karma. You kind of always want to have a balance. So people will look at the image first, and then they'll read the text, the title. And it's a little weird to have the title broken up and then the small text in the middle. So that can be a little confusing as well. But it's basically fine. So the other things I want to do, this text doesn't stand out as much as it should. So I duplicated this text, added another layer up on top, which is this one, with a little bit of an overlay. So it doesn't do very much. It's just there's more shadow and it's a little bit lighter, so it stands out from the background a little bit better. I also wanted to try to bring this van, because now that there's all this text, the van is kind of too dark, and that's really the center image, so it should stand out a little bit more. So I think what I did is just basically copied the van, including the surfboards, and put it up here on top, and I put it in front of this other bad text, which gives it a little bit more of a 3D effect. I need to go back and clean up in here a little bit more, but it kind of gives that, it makes it so it more, people talk a lot of authors talk about pop, and what they mean by pop is usually color contrast, or like the 3D effect you can achieve with layers. So there's a foreground and a background. You can do that with text. It's not always necessarily the right thing to do, because what you really want is your whole cover to look like one piece of art, like one flat piece of art. You don't really want it to like be 3D. Anyway, I'm going to stop this video now because I need to keep doing some cover design work. I hope it's a little bit helpful about cover design in general, and travel, memoir, and personal biography especially. Even if you're going cheap or you're hiring a cheap designer, it helps to be aware of, what you don't want to start from a blank slate and just make everything up as you go along. You want to look at, the rules of cover design, what works for your genre, who you're targeting, what your audience is going to respond to, and try to build a cover that communicates the right things to the right audience, because most of them will never read your blurb or your back copy description. The cover has to do most of the job, almost all of the marketing or the visibility of the promotion. The cover is going to be the first and only thing they see. So it's really got to do its job, and that's where I see a lot of personal biography and travel memoirs fall off a little bit, is because they just make a cover that's a little bit too simple, or that focuses more on the story, or communicates what the author wants to say about the book, when it really just has to really quickly communicate the genre and the topic to the right audience to make them interested. Thanks a lot. You can grab some free book cover tutorials and templates at DIYbookcovers.com, or follow me on Creativity if you need more publishing and marketing help. Thanks. Bye-bye.